hope you are as excited as I am that this book has now been published a few days ago. Today, I want to talk about first the research map, which is really about the 27 chapters that discuss one workflow from trading idea all the way to live deployment and how we do this in the book and why this is useful. We then talk about a new component in the book that wasn't present in the second edition, which is case studies, which shape very much how you can use the book and what it talks about. And then also the resource map, which talks about the various additional ecosystem components. There is a lot that in 2026 you can do to support and produce a different learning experience than you could 6 years ago. So there's a lot more available today than there used to be. So the book is organized, and let me say that I'd like you to feel encouraged to ask questions throughout the presentation at any time. Speak up, ask away in the chat. We will have some time for questions at the end, but also if you have questions during the presentations, please don't hesitate to ask them. Now, the book is organized around the machine learning for trading workflow. We did have that in the second edition, so there was a workflow, of course, already, but the book wasn't really organized around it. It introduced a lot of different models and techniques and tried to show how you would use a model to build a trading strategy. This time, the book is organized along this workflow, and we'll see in a minute in which way that can work. But it does really lay out the data infrastructure, which we need for our strategy research and for the live deployment, of course. So then we discussed the strategy research loop in depth with a new introduction into how you actually come up with a trading idea, how you think about the economic rationale that you hopefully have behind a strategy to understand why it would actually be reasonable to expect that with your trading idea you should expect some excess return and why that excess return might still exist or what would cause it to be competed away. Once you have framed your idea and analyzed its feasibility, look at potential frictions and costs that may make it harder to implement it, you can go on an iterative process to decide how you can leverage machine learning to generate signals that provide decision support as you actually design a strategy. So we dedicate a lot more room now on label and feature design, cover new models, all of this in the service of providing inputs into an actual trading strategy, which we discuss downstream. Historical simulation, how you translate model outputs into orders and positions, how you manage them when they're live. And after you've done all this and you evaluated your strategy historically, you hit the evidence boundary and need to ask yourself whether the evidence that you've collected is really trustworthy and likely to survive in a real market. So you spend quite a bit of time on the various multiple testing controls and the risks of backtest overfitting and multiple testing adjustments and so forth. And then we also discuss what happens when you are live, which we didn't have in the second edition at all. So there are new chapters on this and other tools that are discussed in more detail. Now, this is kind of the high level framework, right? Based on a solid data infrastructure, you go from a trading idea all the way to live deployment. Once you actually start working on this, you'll encounter many granular decisions that you need to take. And that is really what the book is about, right? So it aims to be hands-on in the sense of once you go from the idea which asset class, which holding period, which specific signals you want to generate, why they should work, all the way to proving that you can extract information from the data with respect to the target, which usually is some forward return. All of these require taking a lot of decisions, and the book really is about laying out these decisions, explaining which options you have, how to think about these options, how to evaluate them, and then take a sound decision in each of these steps along the sort of decision process. And that then ultimately leads you to live deployment. So it becomes very tangible, and it goes literally from the beginning, as I said earlier, mechanism, feasibility, kind of what kind of opportunities should exist, why, who's on the other side of the trade, data construction, right? Thinking about the potential information that you can obtain. How do you pre-process it in a sound way so you don't introduce any look-ahead bias, leakage, etc. um, Kind of how should you design the learning task? What is actually useful decision support for the trading strategy that you aim to implement? What horizon? How should you deal with um, regression versus classification tasks, etc., and so on and so forth, right? Which signals could make up with, which kind of features could produce signal for the sort of claim, for the idea that your trading strategy represents? How do you set up a robust historical simulation that gives you good evidence, whether what you try out historically, whether that actually carries forward into the period where you aim to deploy the strategy, right? What evidence is useful? How do you interpret it correctly? How do you evaluate different models and compare them? How do you justify adding more complex models to the mix? And how do you adapt and adjust the results after you tried a lot of different things, which naturally biases your results upward, right? Because there's random variation in results. And if you try a lot of things, some things will look good just by chance. So how do you think about this? How do you adapt this numerically? And how do you implement all of this? How do you choose between different techniques? From the deflated Sharpe ratio to multiple testing controls, Rademacher antiserum, etc. Bootstrap. So there are many different techniques, and we cover all of those. We cover then also the many choices in the design of a historical simulation. How do you think about cost? How do you look at market impact, shortfall overall? All of these aspects are ultimately decisions that you need to take, and you need to take them consciously instead of accepting defaults. And as you take them, you want to know the pros and cons. So that in essence is what the book is organized around, and it aims to give you hands-on guidance with practical examples. It's organized along the workflow. So we cover the data infrastructure first. As in the second edition, we have a lot of detail on market microstructure, but plenty more this time. There are new data sets that use different tick data for longer time periods than just a single day. So you can compute more different sort of high frequency features and insights into the process at that higher cadence. We also have much more on synthetic data at this time. Obviously, the technology has advanced quite a bit. We have diffusion models and so forth. So there's a lot more to cover here. The part two is the essence of the setting up your overall research design and coming up with the foundation for a machine learning model. So design the learning task, think about which labels make sense, and then of course which features to design and select for a model. How do you evaluate them individually? How do you evaluate them collectively? We have a whole new chapter on model-based features. That it's everything from Kalman filters to linear models to volatility predictors, regime models, etc. Right? So the general concept that instead of computing simply some features from data using some deterministic calculation, like a momentum feature, volatility feature, some cross-sectional relative feature, you can have models that use also historical data and produce something that maybe is more informative about the future, which is what the model tries to capture. And you can either use outputs from these models or model aspects like model parameters, etc. And so we cover this in detail, but of course also cover how you have to be more careful, because now you're sort of fitting a model inside your overall model development process. So you have to be extra careful about all the risks of introducing leakage and look-ahead bias in this at this part. Of course, we focus a lot on different models and algorithms. It's really not the front and center piece of the book, but clearly there are different algorithms to cover, and we have, starting with a linear baseline, where we also explain how you do correct walk-forward cross-validation, maybe combinatorial cross-validation, how you think about this carefully, think about this, in a way that first is valid again in terms of avoiding leakage, etc. But also to mimic your actual sort of operations. There's a certain retraining frequency, and so there are questions that are derived from when and how you will deploy a strategy live that you want to take into account as you design this. And then we lay out how it could make sense to add more complex models to the mix, gradient boosting, tabular deep learning for time series, latent factor models, and also we cover for the first time causal machine learning, double machine learning, etc., to see whether the mechanism that you postulated, whether there's some evidence that this actually survives simple correlation analysis. We have much more material this time on the design of a strategy. So we used to have an introduction into backtesting using zipline. Now we cover in much more detail the vectorized and event-based backtesting. We have a new backtesting library that I introduce in a minute. And we cover sort of in more detail how you have to be careful, how you design your historical simulation, right? Because if you don't have an accurate reflection or representation of the environment that you will be using to trade, then the results that you get from a simulation aren't really very trustworthy to begin with, right? Every risk of backtest overfitting not even coming into play here. We cover transaction cost in much more detail. We look at market impact, how to model it properly, risk management, how you can address risk management in various ways, and have a full synthesis of the case studies that I'll discuss in a minute here as well. Now, of course, in 2026, we have to dedicate substantial space and attention to generative AI. So besides reinforcement learning, which is still around, but is covered very differently in this edition, in the sense that we look at market making and execution and hedging as main applications for reinforcement learning, rather than sort of a trading bot that trades independently, as we had in the second edition. These specific applications are much more empirically supported and successful and actually used, whereas the idea that a reinforcement learning agent operates autonomously in the market is something that I think is a little bit out of reach at this point. So, of course, we cover reinforcement learning and how you can use retrieval augmented generation and knowledge graphs, etc., to benefit from the capability of LLMs to process unstructured data and incorporate those into the research or feature generation process. And we have a full chapter on autonomous agents, where we look at Bridgewater's AIA forecasting agent and have an implementation of this to illustrate how to think about the engineering of an agent from the ground up, thinking about the prompt engineering, context engineering, harness engineering, and that agent actually runs on our website live. So you can also see how to actually deploy such a thing in production eventually in a loop. So that's the generative AI portion. And then we, of course, have this new part on live trading and post-deployment operations, MLOps, etc. That's also new. So there are all sorts of decisions. How do you make sure that the strategy that you simulated historically is actually identical to what you're planning to deploy live, both technically, how do you, and in performance terms, so how do you measure whether drift occurs, how do you monitor it, how do you decide to modify, retrain, or even abort, all of this, both prior to deployment and then, of course, after deployment. Now, what's very new in the book is case studies. We did have various examples in the second edition. These were all a little ad hoc, like here is a chapter about gradient boosting. Let's download some Japanese equities and see how we could create a strategy with this. And then here's a chapter about deep learning, and let's get some other data and see how that works. And that's useful because it illustrates generally how to work with the data, but it doesn't really allow for systematic comparison and see how you take the same decision differently in different markets for different asset classes at different horizons, different frequencies, etc. So this time we created 9 different case studies based on different data sets. in different asset classes at different holding periods or frequencies. So we start with a foundational case study that just uses ETF data from Yahoo Finance, easy to download, 100 assets daily covering 20 years, which is nice because you can cover different asset classes in sort of one go, because ETFs represent so many different things, from equities to commodities, US international equities, fixed income, and so forth. Of course, we have crypto this time around, using perpetual futures, and illustrating a strategy around funding rate signals. We have, again, NASDAQ 100 provided by AlgoSeek. AlgoSeek was very generous and provides minute data for 2 years intraday, large data set with a lot of order flow based features, so market microstructure focus. We use this at a 15-minute frequency in the book to make it manageable, but you have access to the minute level data, so you can also revise this and dive further into a higher frequency implementation here. Also by AlgoSeek, we got a data set that includes S&P 500 equity end of day data, but also option chain, sort of full option chain on the underlyings, and that is very rich because it contains equity analytics. So we have one case study that looks at how you can use options analytics, implied volatility, and skew, and so forth as features in an equity-focused strategy. So you hold the equities, the underlyings. And then later we have an actual option strategy where we build straddles from the option chains and trade those, looking especially at the transaction cost associated with them and how you can manage this successfully. We also have US firm characteristics, which is an academic data set that comes with a lot of fundamental data. So if you're interested in fundamentals, there's also something there you can use. And we cover FX and CME futures at daily frequency after constructing the continuous daily series from underlying hourly data. And we have the good old wiki data from Quandl back in the day that played a big role in the second edition as well. So a large US equities panel covering some 40 plus years and up to 3,000 symbols. The idea here is to show, and these case studies run all the way from chapter 6 through chapter 20, to illustrate again and again how you apply or the same process with the set of decisions that are laid out at the beginning again and again, but end up in different spots depending on the market you're in, the asset class you're in, the frequency of the data, the time horizon that your trading strategy suggests, and so forth, right? So it's a rich sort of environment to learn by comparison how things work or don't work. So as I said, in 2026, we wonder, why would we just produce a book? Everything is just a prompt away, right? So how do we create something that does justice to the additional capabilities that we have today to produce output? So first of all, the companion repo has now 400 plus notebooks. That's of course driven by the case studies, which come with 200 notebooks by themselves. So each case study has almost 20 notebooks where it covers everything from the initial feasibility analysis to the modeling and strategy development analysis, so an end-to-end analysis and implementation. So that's 200 notebooks. And then, of course, we have for the 26, 27 chapters, a lot of detail and examples. What's also new is that we now have 6 libraries that support the book. I'll show them in a minute. They support the end-to-end machine learning for trading workflow, from sourcing data to live trading, including backtesting, statistical diagnosis, feature generation, and everything. The book also now comes with over 100 primers. So we excluded or removed some of the more introductory material and moved this into primers, so that, if you want to read up on how a linear regression works or what momentum actually is, then you can do that there. And we can focus the book really on the sort of more hands-on practical trading decisions, and leave both introductory and certain specialized advanced material out of the book, so that you can construct your own little menu for your learning journey. And of course, we have coding agent skills. What would a book be in 2026 without coding agent skills? Naturally, quant finance is a tricky domain. Public code is available, but of mixed quality and scarcer than other domains. So coding agents sometimes have a harder time implementing things correctly. So therefore, we thought it's a good idea to encode some of the methods and things that we teach as skills. So how can you work through this? You can obviously, read the chapters. They are designed to understand the techniques, how they work, how you would use them. This is all the conceptual stuff, so to speak. You have the primers to, fill in gaps or things where uh, you may know a little less about, have forgotten certain details, and you can refresh them there. Ultimately, it's all about practice in this field. So you definitely want to have the notebooks open while you read or after you read it. And so you want to run the relevant notebooks and work through the case studies. You probably want to get familiar with the libraries. They implement a lot of useful techniques, and these can ultimately also become a tool for agents. If you build agents that do research in this domain, then it's useful for them to have reliable tools, and to have libraries that implement important concepts can be quite helpful in this context. And of course, you can iterate on the case studies, so you can use the case studies as a starting point. They are designed not to show you how to make money in the market. And so they're not sort of optimized and built in order to perform well. So the performance is actually quite diverse, as you would expect. You will find as you, for the first time, try out something new with a new data set and in a new asset class. So some perform well, and some don't perform all that well at all, especially on the holdout set, and actually new data. So we implement this all the way from training, validation, and then at the end we have one holdout set where we show how this strategy would actually have fared had you deployed it based on all your validation process. So you see the experience there is mixed, and that of course is an invitation to refine. We also, for the first time, provide courses. That's novel. We're here on Maven, right? So I thought, after people had asked me many times during the second edition whether there exists anything like a course, I'm experimenting now with the offer of an in-depth research to production course. The first cohort is currently underway. We have the 4th week lecture actually coming up in half an hour or so. And so far, I think the cohort enjoys it very much. It is a very hands-on course where the idea is that you actually either take an existing case study, and depending on your ambition and capabilities and time that you have, you really develop it into something new. So you iterate it and build it into something new, or you just content yourself with understanding it and changing a few things, or you build an entire new application. So several students are taking their own data sets and building a new trading strategy within this framework. And the course and my role is about providing guidance, mentorship, etc. And the course also ends with with an in-depth one-on-one discussion on the research process and what the strategy currently is performing. Right. So this is really a course that aims or targets folks that are interested in really trading live. Many of the current students have already some trading experience, some long-standing experience as professionals in hedge funds, others sort of getting into it. Some are seasoned machine learning engineers, others are coming from the trading side, are new to machining. So it's a mix, and it accommodates sort of all these different backgrounds, but the goal is to actually move towards trading something live rather than just toy examples. We also have 2 additional offerings. As I mentioned, the book now contains a chapter on autonomous agents. So we implement the Bridgewater AIA forecaster, interesting multi-agent system that Bridgewater shows performs on par with human super forecasters in certain environments. And we take apart how it works. So we first take it apart and then we build it all the way to live deployment in a single-day workshop. And of course, a shorter workshop is also available on how to work effectively with coding agents. that is really based on my personal experience, which has been shaped over the last year through a very extensive experience with coding agents, both good and bad. So that's what we talk about in that workshop. The workshops run occasionally. The multi-agent forecasting workshop actually is happening again this Saturday. So if you're interested, there's still time to get on board. The next cohort for research to production will start in September. So there's plenty more time to get ready for that. And there may be a coding agent workshop at some point in August, if there's interest and time. So this is the book website. I recommend to, if you're not familiar yet, to take a look. Plenty of resources available here. Obviously, details on the chapters and what they contain. The case studies are here laid out in more detail than I just described, so you can take a look at the data sources, the sort of concepts behind them, and get a sense of what might interest you in particular. The libraries here this is the home for the documentation. And here you can see that we have data libraries from sourcing data from more than a dozen or maybe even 24 different providers, price data, fundamental, some alternative, an engineering library that's mostly about engineering features, setting up cross-validation and so forth. A models library that incorporates a few finance-specific models. So it's not a substitute for, say, XGBoost or TensorFlow or PyTorch. It contains implementations of typically latent factor models and other finance-specific models that otherwise you just find in research papers without implementations. The diagnostic library is one of the centerpieces, contains a lot of different tools to evaluate the performance of features, of backtests, tear sheets, and statistical methods to evaluate the risk of backtest overfitting and general multiple testing. The backtesting library is also new. You may know that I've been maintaining the Quantopian set of libraries since the second edition. So that's Zipline and Pyfolio and AlphaLens. And these are great libraries, but they also have been, launched over a decade ago. So it felt like they could merit. It was time maybe for a refresh. And so these libraries represent this refresh. Backtesting, the backtest library is substantially faster than Zipline and has been developed by testing it and comparing it against all the established open source libraries. So Zipline, Backtrader, VectorBT, the Lean, etc. And it has configurations that allow you to mimic the behavior of all of these libraries while also understanding how it differs or how you can make it differ. So there's a lot of transparency around the setup of the historical simulation and execution behavior, etc. So that's quite useful and speeds up things a little bit. And then also there's a live deployment library that works with Alpaca and interactive brokers. And here's the repo. So lots of stuff in here, all ready for you to download. So yeah, and here are the courses on Maven if you're interested. Good. Your time. Any questions?